Hi everybody, back with another video. Today I'm going to do an audio video. I'll put some pictures up to keep things interesting. In commemoration, I suppose, or to mark the beginning of a new school year, and down the street, the school at which I've taught for a number of years, haven't taught at for about 10, a little Catholic college, I am going to talk about the problems with the Catholic view of marriage. Self-revelation here, or self-disclosure here. I've been married for 23 years. Went through Catholic ceremony, two believers, husband and wife got married. Of course, my views have changed a great deal over the years, but I think that my views are, or perhaps are less relevant today than in this video than perhaps you might think, because I'm talking about the problems with the Catholic view of marriage. The reason I don't think I have a bias or whatever is that I think really the Catholic view is the best view. So even though I'm criticizing it here, it's hard for me, in fact, it's impossible for me to think up a better alternative to the Catholic official Orthodox sacramental view of marriage. I've studied it a great deal, and again, I've had 20 plus years personal experience. I've read lots of canon law. I'm not a canon lawyer, don't have a canon law degree, but I've read a lot of canon law, a lot of theology of marriage and the sacraments and so on. My view is neither to promote it or to discourage it. I suppose that's fair to say. So I'm going to try to keep my thoughts organized here, try to do the best I can. So given the relative popularity of the previous video, which amassed more views in a day, I think, than most of my videos get in a month, so it's relative popularity. So given that popularity, certainly it seems like there's a bit of an appetite out there for this subject, and I'll try to make it interesting, even salacious if I can. So to begin with, have I said begin with a few times already? To begin with, let me perhaps just explain why I think this topic is an important one. Well, of course, as you know, that more than 1 billion people in the world describe themselves as Catholic. I think of that billion, probably 0.1% really truly understand marriage in the full theological sense of the word. When I get married, I had not begun my advanced theological training. I had spent 1 year in the seminary, actually a couple years before my marriage, and of course I was always a very strong reader, studied philosophy, studied history, especially history of the church and so on. So relatively speaking, I knew more about the sacrament of marriage than most people in their 20s undertaking marriage. So I knew more of the idea, I knew more of the theology, but of course, being only in my early 20s, had little practical knowledge and zero experience of what it was like to be married. You know, you certainly have ideals and all that stuff, and obviously idealism is what made me join the Catholic Church when I was 17, and the same idealism made it a no-brainer that I would marry a Catholic woman and try to raise our children in reflecting the sacramental philosophy, the sacramental theology of the Church. As a convert, of course, I didn't have parents who were Catholic, but my parents stayed married through through my father's life. Their marriage ended after 39 years upon my father's death, about 14 years ago now. So I had I obviously had an example in my house of marriage. What kind of marriage it was, what kind of description it deserves is not my place to say, and of course it would be rather insulting were I to try and put a terms on a marriage when, for instance, my mother's still alive. That would be quite disrespectful. But obviously someone who converts from one religion or from no religion to another does so with the idea that they're entering into something better. People don't usually choose a worse philosophy or a worse religion and give up a better one. So the idea of marriage that my parents exemplified was, of course, like most of the marriages that happen in North America or in the Western world, are a reflection of the Christian tradition, even if that's not an intentional thing. So even people who don't espouse a Christian belief, when they think of marriage, they think of marriage very much in terms of the Christian tradition set up by the Catholic Church, the great thinkers, St. Augustine, who really was the first to develop sacramental theology of marriage, and the codification of it in the thought of people like Thomas Aquinas, Council of Trent, and all that. And of course, a very significant moment in the history of marriage in the West came along in the 16th century with Martin Luther and the changes that he brought about to a great portion of the Western world with his non-sacramental view of marriage. So that's definitely extremely important. Luther's view is extremely important if you want to consider the view of marriage held in the Western world by anybody at all. So you've got St. Augustine and you've got Martin Luther. Everybody else would be secondary to the influence of those two people on the sacramental theology of marriage. So whether you're Protestant or not, you are still influenced by those two theologies. So Catholicism calls marriage a sacrament. Now, a sacrament is the Latin word for the Greek word mysterion. So it's a mystery, it's a rite, it's one of those principal things in a religion. Okay, so every religion has its rites, rites. The central rites of the Catholic religion are the 7 sacraments. Protestantism generally endorsed 2 or 3 sacraments. Baptism, of course. Some of them held on to the Eucharist as the Lord's Supper, but changed very much. And some, like certain Anglicans and certain Lutherans, held on to ordination. But generally, these are non-sacramental religions. Protestantism is a non-sacramental religion. What are sacraments? Sacraments are the visible, concrete elements of religion. So you could call them the magical elements, or you could call them the concrete forms of the spirituality of Catholicism. And again, I'm not trying to disparage it one bit. I've already said that the Catholic view is the best view of marriage that I am aware of, even though it's not perfect. And in what perfection lies, I do not know. But I think it's very important always, you know me, I love questioning things, I love examining things. I raise more questions than I answer, but I think the questions that I raise are useful to further our knowledge of things or appreciation of things in the world. Okay, so the Catholic view is that marriage is a sacrament, much like baptism, and you can't be unbaptized. The holy bread and wine that's changed into the body and blood of Christ can't be unsanctified, and a priest can't be unordained. Therefore, as well, marriage can't be unmade except by the death of one of the members. So marriage is always considered a covenant or a contract. And this is a language that comes out of the Old Testament. Covenant with God is a contract, and marriage itself is one of those contracts too. It is a promise, it is a vow, it is a contract made between two people and God. And it has to last for life, just like the other sacraments. And it's something that's annulled or annihilated or ceases to be when one of the couple dies, and only then. So everything else might be called an annulment. An annulment means that the marriage never happened. So for instance, with baptism, if someone baptized you with Pepsi, it wouldn't be a baptism. So somebody who got an annulment, the church is saying they were baptized with Pepsi. So something didn't happen that was supposed to happen. Or if you went to Mass and a kid performed the rite of the Mass who was not ordained priest, well, the Mass never happened. Okay, so you can say what he played around with, and kids like to play the priest and celebrate Mass. Well, that's not real Mass. Okay, so a real sacrament isn't performed. So for instance, if you married someone who was drunk or someone who was under the age of reason, no marriage would have occurred. Now, the biggest problem with marriages today, or the reason why they get annulled most frequently, is that there's a lack of understanding of what either one or both of the couple are undertaking. So if you don't understand what the church's view of the sacrament is, then you can't affect the sacrament. The sacrament doesn't happen. The sacrament of marriage is one of those sacraments where the intention of the people doing it matters a great deal. So in baptism, the Catholic view is the intention of the recipient of baptism doesn't necessarily matter. So you can baptize a baby, for instance. The baby has no idea that it's being baptized, but it's still considered a legitimate sacrament. But with marriage, it can only happen if the people are aware it's happening, the couple is aware it's happening, and they intend it. Okay, they're fully conscious and they're fully aware of what they're undertaking. An annulment is not a divorce. It means the marriage never happened. Divorce is used by the church, and it just means a separation in the legal sense of the word. So it's a separation that Canada recognizes, or the United States, or Italy, or whatever recognizes. It has no sacramental bearing. So if there is no such thing, in other words, as a Catholic divorce, and an annulment is not understood as a Catholic divorce, it's understood as something that never happened. And if that sounds like a cop-out to you, well, so be it. Whether it's a cop-out or not, that's the church's understanding. So when a marriage happens, though, it happens, and it happens for life. So you can't unbaptize and you can't unmarry. And even say if one person goes off and commits adultery, or goes off and thinks they marry somebody else, or has a sexual relationship with somebody else, the church says that person is committing adultery. That person is still married to the first person, whether they know it or not. So that's what happens. It creates a bond that lasts with the couple until one of their death. And then after one of the couple's death, one is free to marry again. The church, ever since St. Augustine, defined the goods of marriage, or the reasons why people would get married, as first, for procreation, so for having babies. So you got to get married to have babies. Number two, for friendship. It strengthens a positive bond between the couple, and friendship is a good and positive thing, and it is part of the sanctification of the couple. So it is part of their worship of God and turning them into better, holier people. Much like taking religious vows is meant to make one a holier person, consecrating their adult life and their sexuality and their family to God's service. So in other words, the sacrament is meant to, or is understood to give the married couple certain powers they didn't have before, just like a priest gets powers at his ordination to be able to do, relatively speaking, outrageous things like turn bread into the body of Christ and wine into his blood, or to forgive sins in the sacrament of confession. Marriage, the sacrament of marriage, is understood to give the man and the woman the power, the capability to live a holy life of marriage. So to be fruitful, life-giving, sanctifying to each other. Okay? It's understood to be a bestowal of power. So that's the understanding of the sacrament. Now, what are the problems? What are the pitfalls? And what are the pitfalls in terms of today's world? Okay, so as I said, sacrament of theology was developed really by St. Augustine in the 5th century, early 5th century, and he lived in a world very much different from our own, but one which is similar enough that the concerns that he had and the questions that he answered that people brought to him about marriage are still very relevant to us today, but not exhaustively so, of course. And if you study the medieval world or the early modern world, you know that people lived in very different contexts than our own and brought different problems to the reality or the sacrament of marriage. The church has developed certainly a huge body of literature, especially its the records of its canonical procedures, so church government, church teaching about, I should say in terms of canon law, a large section of canon law deals with marriage itself, because obviously I think it's quite obvious that most of the problems that are brought to canon lawyers and to church judges are marriage problems. So that's the number one thing that's brought to the canon law services of the church. I think most people, even if you haven't studied history, most people today would understand that people viewed women differently in the past than today. And most people think that we have a better understanding of women today than they had in the past. I think that's nonsense, but I certainly understand why they're saying what they're saying. I think we have a very poor understanding of femininity and masculinity today, and I think The only thing that can be said is that the people of today think they're the rightest, just like every other generation in the past thought they were the rightest about everything. So obviously one of the big problems, of course, or I should say the context in which we consider the problems of marriage are, how does a society come to the altar, so to speak? So in the ancient Roman world, they would have their specific problems and concerns and presuppositions about who men and women are and what marriage is. And in the medieval Germanic world, they'd have their view. And today we have our view, which is, I would say, a feminist, whatever, worldview. And so, I mean, feminism obviously is partly the product of Christian civilization, but it's also the product of forces inimical to that view. And I think most of the problems that marriage faces today, I should say, the Catholic view of marriage faces today, is confronting elements that are antithetical to it. Okay, so look at the idea of a covenant or a contract. Look at the legalistic idea here. So in the Roman world and somewhat in the medieval Christian world, but less so, women were considered property, for better or for worse. Very much so in the Roman world, but less so in the Catholic medieval world. And that was because basically the gospel doesn't support the idea that people can be property per se, but it does support a sort of subordination in that sense. And I think the word subordination is a fairly neutral word. I think it's a legitimate word that the Christian view, and I think that this is easily verified through reading the New Testament, that the Christian view is one of subordination of women to men. I think that's legitimate. Now, the idea of in what that subordination consists, that's quite another matter. And the idea that, or the question, should this continue, this idea of subordination continue? Is this one of the vestiges of an ancient worldview that Christianity needs to throw off, for instance? Like the ancient church, in fact, up until about a century ago, or a century or two ago, the church said that usury was wrong, was sinful. Usury, of course, is charging interest on loans. Now, obviously, the church doesn't teach that anymore. It may teach that it's not the best thing in the world and that it is prone to sinful behavior, but it certainly doesn't excommunicate people. It doesn't excommunicate people who work in the banking industry or in the investment industry anymore, but it would have in the Middle Ages. Most certainly. Okay, so is the church's view, or I should say, is the ancient New Testament view of women as one of subordination, is that still a view carried forth? Well, I think that it is. Looking at, for instance, the exclusive claim, the priesthood to men only and not to women. The Pope can only be a man, bishops can only be men, priests can only be men. So there is an idea here of difference. I think that if you study the advanced or rich theology of someone like John Paul II, who was Pope 3 popes ago, I think that you would say he wouldn't like the word subordination. He would probably look to wanting to use words of difference and his favorite word, complementarity. So humanity is best when the gifts and virtues of the different sexes are allowed to flourish and complement each other. So what a man brings to the marriage as a man and what a woman brings to the marriage as a woman are not the same thing, but they're both necessary parts or necessary elements for a fruitful and holy life. Okay, John Paul II would prefer the word complementarity rather than subordination. But to be frank, there is I cannot understand that marriage or the sacrament of marriage can exist without some kind of sexual subordination. But that's just my view. So lots of modern day theologians would very much disagree with my view about the necessity of the word subordination. Now, I'd say that insofar as anyone rejects the word subordination or the reality of subordination, then one has no longer a marriage. And this is one of the biggest problems with the Catholic view of marriage in the modern world, is that it's very hesitant to spell out the hierarchy within the marital unit itself. So what we get is chaos. So in the modern world, typically what you have is an idea, and this is supported by most governments in the Western world. They assume that children are the property of their mother and not of their father, whereas the opposite was the case in Roman Christianity and medieval Christianity. Children were considered the property, from a legal standpoint, of their father, not their mother. Now, the idea that children are property at all is just a shorthand way of saying, I think in the modern world, it's a shorthand way of saying, upon whom is the onus of legal responsibility for someone. So in most of the Western countries, women are allowed to, for instance, abort their unborn babies. So that connotes an idea of ownership. The woman owns that thing which is in her body, the baby. Very much in the medieval or ancient sense, where a man was said to be the legal owner of children. Okay, so if you don't like the word ownership, then it's pretty hard to explain how abortion can be justified from a legal standpoint. So ultimately, when we talk about marriage as a contract, a covenant, these are synonyms, contract and covenant. Insofar as marriage is a contract, there has to be irrevocable rights and duties spelled out. So non-negotiable rights and duties. So what those things are obvious in some regards, but not so obvious in some other regards. Now, the most obvious elements of right is the right to love, the right to sex, the right to emotional and physical support, and all those things. So the idea today that people have a right to sex within marriage is also problematic in the modern feminist context. But again, how does marriage operate if there is no rights? A contract is about binding obligations and rights. And insofar as we want to eliminate those aspects, then we eliminate marriage as a legal contract. It is something else. It is not a contract, and therefore it has no legal character. It has no legal standing. It can't be made sense of in courts of law, whether they're secular or ecclesiastical courts. Of course, now ever since the early 1800s, with the Romantic Revolution, the idea of marriage as primarily about love, the affection, love, the feeling, is a new thing in marriage. Now, the feeling of love was understood by St. Augustine in the 5th century as a fruit of marriage, but it certainly wasn't vital to undertaking marriage. So one could marry someone one didn't love. In Augustine's sense of the word, and in Martin Luther's sense of the word in the 16th century, one can undertake a contract without love. One can undertake the contract of marriage without love. Now, as this became centralized in the worldview from the novelists and the poets of the early 19th century to today, there has to be some kind of, how do you orient a subjective emotion? How do you orient it to a legal framework? There's no way. And marriages, or I should say law courts, have been very crude instruments in trying to enforce the goods of marriage in that case. So ideas of alienation of affection, for instance, used to be talked about, which has been really supplanted by the idea of no-fault divorce. No-fault divorce means it doesn't matter what people were doing, that the divorce is simply a reality when one person wills it. So the bond of marriage as a legal bond is dissolved when one person says, I don't want this anymore. Of course, that's not how contracts work in any other context. So it was very easy to fit the idea of marriage into the Catholic worldview, even though the New Testament and the first Christian writers, people like Origen, Tertullian, St. Paul, St. Augustine, the rest of the church fathers, even though they all said that marriage was a second-rate kind of life, the best kind of life was the celibate life. This is clear from St. Paul and so many other writings of the ancient world, that marriage was nevertheless easy enough to put into the Christian worldview because it was the idea, like how else are you supposed to have children? How else are you supposed to run the small scale economy of the household without marriage? So if you think back a little to the circumstances of daily economic life in the ancient world and the medieval world, most people for most of history have been farmers, so have been peasants who worked a small bit of land and were married. So a farmer would have a wife who would give her sons who would be able to work the farm with him. And that was basically essential to life. If we look today, children aren't essential to the life of most people in modern industrial economy. And therefore, spouses aren't necessary either. A woman can have a job and buy her own house or apartment and car on her own, and so can a man. So if we're going to talk about the broader service of marriage and begetting of children to the economy at large, well, that's a different thing. And sometimes people have been punished for not supplying children to the state. But generally, the scale of interest in marriage has always been related to the household economy. Women need husbands to take care of them and bring food for their children and themselves because the woman is raising children. And the man, the farmer, needs a wife to run the house and protect his children when he's out in the farm. That's the basic rationale of marriage. That's the basic material rationale, the common sense for why someone would ever get married. Now today is a vastly different circumstance. Marriage is not necessary for running the household economy. It's not necessary for a man who works or a woman who works. It's necessary to children, but children are only necessary if a state is going to continue or civilization is going to continue. Children are not necessary for the continuance of adult men and women as they were in the past. So in other words, the modern world casts for the first time into question the rationale for getting married, for begetting children. People don't need to get married to stay alive anymore. They used to. They don't anymore. So how do we defend or understand or present as good and useful marriage when it no longer has a vital economic function? Okay, when something has a vital economic function, its rationale is apparent to everybody. Now today, it's, as I said, it's not vital, and so marriage has to be rationalized in another way. And it's no surprise that as the Industrial Revolution began, then Romanticism begins virtually at the same time. So Romanticism is a reaction, in a sense, to the changed economic or material circumstances of society. So just when life is becoming different, thanks to the invention of the steam engine, the cotton gin, and all that, all of a sudden, new rationales are required for marriage. It doesn't have a economic rationale, requires another one. And so people look to the affections. So in times past, as I've said in a previous video, affection and marriage had virtually nothing to do with each other. This is a modern invention of the last 2 centuries. Marriage was an economic choice, an economic fueled decision, and now it is an emotionally fueled decision. Can the sacrament of theology survive in this new situation? I say no. Okay, so if everything is reducible then to emotion, to the subjective states of people's minds, then a contract can no longer be looked at objectively. It has to be examined subjectively. And that's the only thing that makes sense. Is this good for me? The question is not, is this marriage vital to the prolongation of my life and the lives of my children? It is then, because it's not, because we have things like welfare programs, and we have daycare, and we have all those things, which mean that my children and I are not going to starve if my husband or wife leaves me, okay, if they fail in carrying out the marital contract. So that creates a whole lot of different responses and ideas about marriage. So it's really interesting how people make a virtue of necessity, and once the necessity is taken away, they they think that all that remains is the virtue. So in this sense, what I mean is marriage was once vitally important for survival, for the survival of every man, woman, and child, so to speak. Today it isn't, and so people who flee their marital obligations aren't viewed as criminals as they were in the past. And that's not because we've grown in our humanity. That's simply because the fact is nobody's going to die when a husband or wife leaves the other person. Now let me turn, if I can, to some of the other practical considerations of the Catholic marriage. Now, sort of stepping outside, for instance, for a moment from the purely contractual or legal examination, the legal dimension of marriage. So if we think in practical terms, the idea of Catholic marriage as the sole place for sexuality, so you develop an understanding, a sexual ethic where sex, sexual desire, sexual expression is solely acceptable within a marriage, within the consensual operation of the marriage itself, the acceptance and enjoyment of two members of the marriage, the man and the woman. This, of course, raises questions in terms of, does the church maintain an unhuman or an inhuman idea of sexual desire so that it is proposing an impossible situation where one, for instance, can only give into a sexual desire through marriage, so that my sexual desire depends upon the acceptance of another person or another person's decision. So if I feel sexual desire, it's up to the other person whether or not I can express that sexual desire. So this rules out things like masturbation, obviously pornography, and going a bit further, of course, as well, it confines marriage to a later stage in life. So sexual desire begins on average in a man or a woman at about age 13, I would say. So one isn't obviously in a position in our society to begin to raise children at 13. In fact, sort of the earliest that anyone, that society at large, I think, would say that one is ready to raise children would be, say, 20. And many people would say, well, that's still too early itself, that one should finish university or training of some sort before one should ever consider having children. So let's say 25. So in other words, in the Catholic view of things, one cannot give into one's sexual dimension from the age of 13 to the age, say, of 25. So that's roughly 12 years. Is that good? Is it possible? Is it advisable? Of course, I think that for situations like this, for people with a strong sexual ethic, marriage generally tends to happen earlier. So even in the past, when marriage was, I think in the past, generally marriage was undertaken earlier for women and later for men, that in a world where one had to have, for instance, a farm or, at least the ability to receive enough remuneration for a few other mouths, a wife and babies, that one had to be old enough to be able to work. So we're talking about 18, probably about 18 for a man, and a woman was considered marriageable by the time she got her period at 13 or 14. That's not to say that a woman was typically married off at that early age, but certainly I think women were often married before their 20s. I'm saying it's often as early as 16 or 17, and men quite characteristically later than that. So this is a problem very much endemic to most societies, isn't it? If you have an idea that that sexuality is the exclusive reserve of marriage, and marriage has an economic reality, then you're tying sexuality into economic status. So that's a bit of a doozy, isn't it? The tendency today with, I would say, the people up the street from me at the little Catholic college would be that they will marry earlier than people whose sexual ethic does not require that it be confined to marriage. So people generally today in our society at large get married rather later. So I think the average now is around 30 years of age for marriage. And I think that strong Catholics would get married perhaps 5 years earlier than the social average at large. Okay, is this a good idea? Is this a bad idea? I think few would dispute that undertaking a lifelong contract, it's a bad idea to do something like that when one is in one's early 20s or even mid 20s. It's a doozy, isn't it? So in the best of all worlds, would people get married earlier than 20 or later than 20? Would people be mature enough to get married earlier than 20? Or is it in fact better when people live more of their life in a state of singleness? Of course, for women, women's fertility begins at about 13 and it really ends by about the mid-30s. So if the average age of marriage is 30, women have a very short window for having children. But if someone marries in their late teens or early 20s, the window's much longer. Now, this is where we get to another problem, the problem of contraception. So the church teaches that contraception is wrong, and if one gets married earlier, then one ends up having more children because they're sexually active during more of the women's fertile phase. So from, say, 13 to 35. And is it a moral issue to have more than, say, the average number of children? The average number of children today is certainly below replacement level. It's below 2.1, depends on the country, but I think in most of the Western world, it is well below 2.1. It's well below 2. It's probably 1.5, which means that the countries in the Western world are relying on immigration and not on procreation to grow or even maintain their populations and their economies. I know that's a case. I see that as a reality in my own country, certainly. Does one have a responsibility to the future of one's country? If you asked me, I would say no, one does not. I don't have a responsibility to ensure that Canada continues into the 22nd century. I don't have that moral obligation. Do I have a moral obligation to pass on my genes? I would also say no, I don't. Okay, so on the other hand, procreation, contraception, late marriage, what are our responsibilities to... I talked about our sexual desire and the psychological service or function or benefit that sexuality brings to one's psychology. But what obligation does one have to the sexual use of one's partner vis-a-vis procreation? What do I mean? Well, if physiologically speaking, if evolutionarily speaking, that sexuality is geared towards procreation, and that's an inescapable fact. Our sexual desires, our sexual reality is geared towards procreation. What duty do we have, what moral duty do we have to fulfill the physiological end of sex? End in this sense is a teleological word. If the point of sex is procreation, and we all know that, of course, basic human facts or basic facts about our biology have a very strong place within human fulfillment, in psychic, spiritual, psychological fulfillment, then abusing that, is that immoral? Okay, so a woman's body is made to have children. It's made to have children as early as, say, 13 and as late as, say, 35. And for instance, things like the motherly instinct is a good thing. And we know that women who don't have children, there's a decrease in happiness in the women. We know that breast cancer, for instance, a great example, is related to, there's a correlation between breast cancer and not nursing. Okay, so there's a teleology suggested then in the breast, that the breast is made and must be directed and used as a feeding device. And when it's not, it's being misused. So the very opposite argument, of course, can be made about, say, for instance, the production of sperm in a man. Sperm is produced daily, and there is a correlation between celibacy and prostate cancer. So just like with breast cancer for non-breastfeeding women, there's a correlation between celibacy in a man and prostate cancer. So generally, when you're not using a body part like it's meant to be used, there are health effects. We know this. We know that the body that's doesn't receive enough physical activity gets unhealthy. We know that a body that eats more food than is required for its functioning is unhealthy. Obesity leads to heart disease and a million other disabilities. So does the use and abuse of sexuality, defined as removed from the procreative function, there obviously are deleterious effects, and therefore what are our moral responsibility towards that? I think most people would agree that if something is very dangerous to a person's health, then there's a moral component there. I think it's easy enough to say that smoking is immoral in some sense. Now, whether it's highly immoral or moderately immoral or insignificantly immoral, that's up for debate. And I think that the reason would be, how dangerous is this thing? I think that one could argue that smoking crack or taking heroin would be more of a moral issue than, for instance, smoking or even drinking alcohol, both things which have deleterious effects on the person and are moral issues, therefore. That the misuse of sexuality, okay, let's look at it in this sense. Women take artificial hormones with birth control. This is messing with the natural cycles of a woman, of her fertility. Is it significant enough to be a moral issue? That's another question. But it definitely falls within the realm of an objective moral consideration. Whether you finally decide in the end that hormonal contraceptions don't signify a significant enough health risk, that's another matter. And that's not for me to answer, because I don't know how significant the threat is. I know that somebody's, say, 30% more likely to get cancer. A woman who uses contraception is 30 or 15 or 10% more likely to get cancer than a woman who doesn't. But are the instances of cancer low enough that 10% or 20% or 30% doesn't actually connote a significant enough moral health dilemma, therefore moral dilemma? Now, there's another dimension here too. Not all health, of course, is physical. A great deal of a person's health is mental. So how do we examine mental health, or I should say, how do we examine marriage from the standpoint of psychological health? Now, in his encyclical against the use of artificial contraception, Pope Paul VI in 1968 said that there's certain dangers with contraception. It turns men against women and women against men, and it tends to objectify women. So it turns women into objects, sexual objects. So they become objects of sexual use when the fact of their fertility is removed. Okay, I think that makes enough sense that, I don't have to spell out the details. But if you can have sex with a woman without taking on the obligation to raise her children, then it's much easier to have sex with a woman. Now, far too little attention's been paid to the consequences of women's sexual use in this age of contraception. I think some people are paying attention to the effect that, we call it the hookup culture, is having. So in other words, are women victimizing themselves? They're free to choose what expressions of sexuality they want. They can choose as many partners as they want. But is this multiplication of partners, the removal of relationship from sex, how detrimental is this to a woman? How detrimental is it to a man? These are important questions. And I think that we're starting to recognize the lies that feminism was insisting upon, i.e. that women could use sexuality and experience sexuality in the same way that men do, which is not a justified assertion, because men and women are simply not the same, and their sexual physiology is extremely dissimilar. It's like apples and oranges. So on the one hand, you have the Catholic view of marriage, which ties the procreative and unitive or enjoyment aspect of sexuality together. It yokes them together and have one without the other. And the complete separation of these two things outside of the Catholic view, both obviously have some potential hazards, don't they? One of the hazards, I think, within the Catholic view is who really is capable of raising 10 or 12 children. Really, in this day and age, in this economic and social and cultural circumstance of the nuclear family, who is able to raise safely and healthily that many children? When because of the sexual desire, Catholic couples marry younger, and because of the prohibition against contraception, they have more children. Is this healthy? It's a legitimate question. Now, on the other hand, the complete reversal of that philosophy of life, where sex is completely divorced from the unitive aspect, so the formation of relationships, that sex is relational, which is worse? Okay, women who are denied their basic desire for relationship, a protective, nurturing relationship, or, on the other hand, Catholic couple who is in some ways compelled to have large families. Okay, so for as much as somebody can exercise healthy control of their sexual desire within a Catholic marriage, really, despite that fact, strong Catholics have larger families than non-Catholics. That's a simple fact. Is it too large? Is it too burdensome? Or is it much better, in fact, than the complete divorce of sexuality from the relationship? I mean, most times the tendency, the logical thing seems to be to find a middle ground. But is there such a thing as a middle ground? I think most people act as though there is one. So marriage today, as it's lived out, is kind of a nonsensical, it's an illogical amalgamation of two incommensurable philosophies. It's a philosophy. Modern marriage is a philosophy where it's okay sometimes to violate physiology, sexual physiology, but sometimes it's not okay. And also sometimes it's okay to divorce sex from its relational dimension, but sometimes it's not okay. So this is a philosophical, mess. But most times, of course, people don't carry out the full implications of their ideology. Most times, whether you're talking about Christians or socialists, communists, vegans, whatever the thought, environmentalists still need to fly their private airplanes, but they have their electrical cars. Communists still need to have universal distribution of income, except for the leadership. Vegans sometimes need to have cheese. I don't know, just an example. Most people who espouse ideals compromise them in some way, and I think most Catholics do that too. So, a matter of fact, even though most Catholics would, most strong Catholics would try to live within the bounds of their religion, that of course they make exceptions here and there. And most people who say that sex is simply a biological function do nevertheless always in some way tie it back to relationship. So the old expression, catching feelings, right? So for as much as one wants friends with benefits, one catches feelings. And the misery we see everywhere in terms of modern dating culture, modern hookup culture, and the misery and lack of success of most marriages. What conclusions are we supposed to draw from this? Who has the better philosophy of life? Well, personally, I still think the Catholics have it righter, that I would definitely rather live in a world governed by Catholic sacramental theology of marriage than one that completely espouses the polar opposite. Absolute, no question. However, does that mean that certain aspects of the Catholic view of marriage are in fact problematic or deleterious? So, does the Catholic view of sexuality, of subordination, of procreation, of relationship, are all these things in some way limited, or should be limited, to maximize happiness? What should we tell people today? What recommendations should we make? So to a young Catholic couple, should we say, I know your view of marriage sounds pretty good, but the fact is, it's virtually impossible to live with somebody else for the extended lifespan of the modern world. So in the past, of course, in Augustine's age in the 5th century, in St. Thomas Aquinas' 13th century, and in Martin Luther's 16th century, the average lifespan was about 40 years. Infant mortality being so high, and of course, women dying in childbirth being so common, one didn't really have to live with another person for very long. So even though marriage was till death, the fact was marriages still never lasted longer than 20 years because adults barely lived past 40, at least both people. So you make a decision at 20 that you're going to marry this person and be with this person for the rest of your life. But the fact is, that's a maximum of 20 years because one of you is going to die within the next 20 years. That's very different from today where the average lifespan is close to 80. So if you get married at 20, 25, your marriage is potentially 50 years long. So that's more than twice as long as a medieval marriage. So 2.5 times as long as your typical medieval marriage. And boy, that is quite a thing. Is it really possible to place a moral obligation upon a young person of that length, that the decision you make now will last you for the next 50 years? Is that conscionable? Is it possible? Is it good to put that expectation on a person? The fact that marriages, even the marriages of people who say they're strong Christians, the fact that the success rate is so low, that separation or divorce or annulment is such a high possibility, argues that the theology of the sacrament of marriage has some real problems adjusting to contemporary circumstances. So, is it moral to tell a young person, 20 years old, that this woman that you have feelings for right now, this beautiful 20-year-old girl right now, with her 20-year-old mind and her 20-year-old lack of experience, that it's a good idea to join yourself to her legally, sacramentally, morally for the rest of your life? That's a pretty big thing, isn't it? In what other ways do we face such decisions in our life? Rarely ever. When someone joins the military, they're obliged to, serve a very short period of time. I think if they don't serve a year or 2 or 3 or 5, then they might, be jailed or something. But that's really not that significant of an undertaking. In what other way do we put such decisions in people's hands? Do we allow people to undertake such a decision at 20 years of age or 25 years of age? On the other hand, or I shouldn't say on the other hand, I should say additionally, is it possible to actually undertake a sacramental contract when one lives in a culture in which there are no ramifications, in which the force of the contract itself, there is no force behind the contract. So one can walk away from the contract of marriage with virtual impunity. In previous cultures, if one divorced or alienated affection from a spouse, one faced real social retaliation. Not anymore, not in today's world. One can easily move to another place. In the medieval and ancient world, one lived and died usually in the same 20 square miles, so one could never really escape one small community. So divorce, adultery, and so on had real cultural implications. And I think some of the early 18th century novels do a fairly good job at showing this. Like, for instance, Anna Karenina, a late 19th century novel, still shows how there's real social implications to divorce or to adultery. But there aren't any anymore because one can simply change one's community very easily with the means of transportation we have today and the vastness of the population and the multicultural horizons, the relativism of our cosmopolitan world. So I suppose in sum, the problems with the Catholic view of marriage today come down to the fact that people live too long, people are too fertile, there's no social support for the marriage contract, there's no social enforcement of the marriage contract, and that alternatives are too easy to come across. So in other words, contraception, divorce, so there's too many temptations, and there's too little aid to living out the Catholic vocation of marriage. Is it impossible? Is it unlikely? Is it heroic? Is it irrational? And finally, let me close with just one more observation that relates to the romanticization of marriage, romanticization of the sacrament, the theological romanticization. So, and I think someone like John Paul II, for as great genius as he was, I think he's partly to blame for this, the romanticization of marriage. The sophisticated the poetic presentation of marriage that John Paul II articulated, does this cause the problem of expectation, high expectations? Now, in earlier times, one was under no illusion that life and marriage was going to be all happiness and romance and good feelings and sexual satisfaction. That wasn't how people approached the world. The world was hard. Work was dangerous. Life was nasty, brutish, and short. Well, when we tell people that marriage is such a high calling, such a beautiful thing, as Catholic sacramental theology says it is, does this, in and of itself, set people up to failure because of extremely high expectations? That's an important last question I'll leave with you. Thanks so much for listening, guys. I hope this was interesting. All the best.